In the previous video, we covered OPSEC recommendations that primarily apply to the offline world. The basic recommendations are essentially to not talk to anyone about your content, or keep it to a bare minimum, to never disclose any personal information, to strongly consider the risks of using your own face or voice, and to never publicly discuss your OPSEC strategies. In this video, we'll begin to delve into the particular strategies designed to protect you online. However, before we begin, I'll reiterate a disclaimer from the previous video. This video series is not meant for more severe threat models where your adversary is potentially compromising your devices through physical access, actively surveilling you, or potentially detaining or arresting you. In these type of situations, you need to consider physical access protection, detecting potential compromise of your devices, and utilizing plausible deniability strategies. If this describes your situation, go read The Hitchhiker's Guide to Online Anonymity, linked in the description. Even if this doesn't fit your situation, this guide covers much of what I present in this video series as well, and is worth reading in its entirety if you're serious about maintaining your anonymity. In addition, this video assumes that you live in the United States, although there will be considerable overlap in applicability to most of the Western world, except perhaps with burner phones. And finally, please take note of the age of this video. All of this information is current, to the best of my knowledge, in March 2024. If you're finding this video years from now, I cannot guarantee every aspect will not be obsolete in some way. And as a final preliminary note, if you're watching this video on YouTube, you will not be able to find any links in the description that I'm referencing, because YouTube will not allow me to insert any external links without first either verifying my identity or waiting some vague and unspecified amount of time as I continue to upload videos. Please find my channel on Rumble or BitChute to find these links. I may also start uploading my videos on Odyssey. The content covered in the remainder of this video series falls roughly into the following 6 categories. 1. Operating systems. 2. Devices. 3. Account creation. 4. Anonymously purchased VPNs, if applicable. 5. Account verification with burner phones, if applicable. And 6. Best practices and de-anonymization threats. For those of you that are tech-savvy, I'll cut to the chase. Use a brand new laptop computer purchased as anonymously as possible, and preferably with Intel IME disabled, and install Qubes OS as the operating system. Non-mainstream accounts are accessed over Qubes Whonix. Any accounts on mainstream platforms are accessed with VPN over Tor. The VPN plan is purchased with Monero or Cache. Mainstream accounts that require a phone number are verified with a flip phone, where the phone itself and prepaid cell plan are purchased with cash. For those of you not as tech-savvy, please continue watching the rest of the video series. First, we'll discuss operating systems, because this has some bearing on what device you will need. I would recommend only 3 operating systems for producing content and accessing accounts: Tails, Whonix, and Qubes. All 3 of these are based on Linux, are free and open source, and most importantly, incorporate the Tor network into their core functionality. To explain why these operating systems are necessary, we need to discuss your IP address, VPNs, and the Tor network. One critical data point that could tie back to your real identity is your IP address. This is true even if you're using public Wi-Fi, given the ubiquitous presence of surveillance cameras. The general public is aware of VPNs, or virtual private networks, by now, and most people would assume using a VPN would be the go-to solution for protecting your IP address. There are numerous problems with this commonly held assumption. All a VPN does is change the entity you're entrusting your network traffic to. Instead of your ISP, or Internet Service Provider, seeing every website you visit, now instead, your VPN provider does. Typically, this is a good trade-off, but you're ultimately placing your trust in the VPN. You're trusting they aren't selling your data, or being forced to provide the data to a government entity, or their servers aren't compromised. This is also assuming that the VPN company isn't a covert government entity themselves. I would consider it almost guaranteed that this is the case with at least one of the major VPN companies. Another problem is that you're trusting the VPN client you're using to not leak your real IP if it fails, or if the VPN connection is dropped, or having something configured incorrectly. A VPN is a single point of failure for protecting your IP address, which should be considered a core secret for protecting your real identity. VPNs have a place in this guide, but are not considered sufficient protection by themselves. The Tor network, which stands for the Onion Router, is an anonymity-focused protocol that works by bouncing your network connection across 3 relay servers, randomly selected from thousands of relays around the world, before connecting to the website you're visiting. The network connection leaving your computer is protected by 3 layers of encryption, with each layer being decrypted as it passes through the 3 relays. The Tor protocol ensures that each relay is only capable of knowing information that is 1 hop away. The first relay, also known as the guard relay, knows your IP address, and the address of the second, also known as the middle relay. The middle relay only knows the IP address of the guard relay, and the third relay, also known as the exit relay. The exit relay knows the IP address of the middle relay and the actual website you're trying to access. As can be seen by this basic explanation, there is no single point of failure. In order to discover your IP address, all 3 relays would have to be compromised. In addition, the Tor network is almost always used in conjunction with the Tor browser. The Tor browser is designed to prevent websites from collecting any identifying information on you through means other than your IP address. VPN advertisements almost never mention this. For example, say you use a normal web browser and you go to Google from your true IP address. Then you clear your cookies and browser data, turn on your VPN, then go back to Google. Google still knows it's you, due to something called browser fingerprinting. Concealing your true IP address is critically important, but it is only one small aspect of remaining private or anonymous online. If you visit google.com using the Tor browser, then reset the browser and go back to Google, it will probably not be able to tell if you're the same person. If you disable JavaScript by using the safest security setting in Tor browser, Google will definitely be unable to tell if you're the same person. But unfortunately, this either breaks most mainstream websites, or the site will demand you enable JavaScript to proceed. That said, the Tor network is not invincible. Government agencies have spent considerable resources trying to break the Tor network due to the prevalence of illegal drug marketplaces and child pornography hosted on Tor darknet websites. As a brief aside, the Tor network supports the hosting of websites within the network itself. These sites have an address that looks like this: 56 mostly random letters and numbers followed by .onion, and require the Tor browser to access them. These websites bounce the traffic through 6 relays instead of 3, so that neither the user nor the website itself knows the true IP address of either party. These websites are also known as hidden services, although the Tor project doesn't use this term officially anymore. When the term dark net is used in common parlance, it is almost always in reference to these .onion websites. So anyway, although the Tor network is not invincible, we're operating under the assumption that unless you're doing something illegal, the possible techniques government agencies would use to de-anonymize users are most likely not going to be employed on us. And it is widely recognized as a much more robust solution to protect your IP address than a VPN. The Tor network does come with 2 significant downsides, though. First is that it is much slower than a VPN. The fastest connection you will see with Tor is about 1 megabit per second, and often much less than that. Second is that many websites block Tor exit node addresses. If they don't block you, they still might prevent you from making an account, logging into existing accounts, or just harassing you with endless CAPTCHAs. There is no solution to the speed issue, but later on in this guide I will show you how to chain a VPN after Tor in order to mitigate the blocking and harassment issue. The Tor browser can be downloaded from torproject.org and can be used on Windows, Mac, Linux, and Android. This is mostly fine if you just want to browse the internet anonymously. If browsing the internet anonymously is all you need to do for now, please watch this video from the very good channel, The Hated One. This video will teach you best practices on using the Tor browser. The problem with the standalone Tor browser is that it is vulnerable to malware attacks. If your browser is infected, or you download an infected file, it could connect to the internet using your real IP address and send that information back to whoever created that malware. This is where Tor-oriented operating systems come into play. As mentioned earlier, these are Tails, Whonix, and Qubes. Tails and Whonix are only capable of connecting to the internet through the Tor network. So even if you are compromised with malware, it is unlikely this malware will be able to discover your true IP address. Qubes is not a Tor-only operating system by default, but it has its own version of Whonix and can be operated in a similar way where it routes all network traffic through Tor. Each operating system has its own pros and cons, which I will briefly discuss as follows. Tails is the most simple and user-friendly of the three options. Its main intended user base is journalists, whistleblowers, and people trying to use the internet anonymously in highly repressive countries. Tails is unique in that it is never actually installed on the computer itself. It is instead run off of a USB flash drive. By default, Tails is a read-only operating system that saves no data on the flash drive unless specifically enabled to do so. This makes Tails quite effective against malware, since the malware will be wiped out each time Tails is shut down. However, if you're going to produce content with Tails, you will need to turn on disk persistence, which partially negates this advantage against malware. Tails is also designed to leave no trace on the computer, so that once it is shut down and the USB drive removed, there will be no forensic evidence of Tails ever being used on the computer. One advantage Tails has over Whonix and Qubes is that the hardware requirements are much lower. Whonix and Qubes run everything within a virtual machine. Tails runs directly on your hardware, making the memory and CPU requirements quite modest. One downside to Tails is that it is difficult to chain a VPN after Tor, therefore making it difficult to create and maintain accounts on mainstream social media sites. As previously discussed, you may be prevented from creating accounts, or be shadow banned indefinitely, or presented with endless CAPTCHAs, or forced to verify your phone number every time you log in. Another downside to Tails is that it is slightly more susceptible to being exploited by advanced malware compared to Whonix or Qubes. I will explain this more in the section on Whonix. But if you're only using non-mainstream platforms, Tails is a very viable option. It is extremely easy to use and offers almost foolproof security. I've included a link in the description to a brief tutorial video on how to install and use Tails. The next operating system to discuss is Whonix. Similar to Tails, Whonix will only connect to the internet through the Tor network. But it differs from Tails in several important ways. First of all, Whonix can only be run as a virtual machine inside of an existing host operating system. This is essentially an operating system running within another operating system. So you would be running Windows, Linux, or Mac as your host operating system, then Whonix as a guest, virtual machine inside of them. This means you have to install virtualization software, the most popular of which being VirtualBox by Oracle. As an aside, if you do end up using the Whonix route, an arguably more secure way is to use Linux as your host operating system and use the kernel virtual machine, or KVM, instead of VirtualBox. The Whonix project recommends KVM for reasons I won't go into here, but I've included a link in the description that explains the advantages of using KVM over VirtualBox. I should also mention that the Whonix documentation also has a section on the advantages of VirtualBox as well, which is why I qualified KVM as only arguably more secure. Anyway, an important and powerful feature of Whonix is that it is run in two separate virtual machines, the workstation and the gateway. The workstation is the VM used to browse the internet and run applications. The gateway handles all the networking, forcing all internet traffic from the workstation to be routed through Tor, and does literally nothing else. This makes Whonix an extremely hard target against malware designed to uncover your true IP address. Unlike Tails, the Whonix workstation has no idea what your actual IP address is. Only the gateway knows this, and the gateway's sole function is to pass encrypted data to and from the workstation over the Tor network. Using Whonix, only malware that is able to escape the virtual machine would be able to discover your true IP address. I am not a malware expert, but it is my understanding that malware such as this would probably only come from an advanced nation-state actor. As opposed to Tails, it is possible to chain a VPN after Tor using Whonix, but it is somewhat complicated. I've added a link in the description to this video for using a VPN within Whonix workstation. An easier way, in my opinion, is to install another virtual machine and then set it up to use the Whonix gateway for internet access. I recently accomplished this using a tutorial on YouTube where he shows you how to install Kali Linux in VirtualBox, then configure it to use the Whonix gateway for network access. Then I installed a VPN client on the Kali Linux virtual machine. This should be possible with any Linux distribution, and even with Windows. I've included a link to this tutorial and other related information in the description. One downside compared to Tails is that programs running on Whonix will not be as quick and responsive due to the overhead of Whonix running as a virtual machine. You will notice things taking longer to load, and possibly your CPU fan running louder than normal. This also means you need a somewhat modern PC or laptop to have an acceptable user experience. Finally, I've also included a link to a short tutorial on Whonix itself. This brings us to Qubes, my recommended OS that I use personally for content creation, including this very video. Qubes basically makes everything your computer does into its own virtual machine, or cube. The base operating system is itself virtualization software. So think of it as running something like VirtualBox directly without having a host operating system at all. There's a virtual machine that just handles the network connection, a virtual machine that handles the firewall, a virtual machine that handles all the USB interfaces, and so on. Then for your actual applications, these will run in different isolated virtual machines themselves. You might have a virtual machine for personal accounts, then an entirely separate one for work, and so on. Unlike normal virtual machines run through VirtualBox, the virtual machines in Qubes don't have their own window. Instead, the individual apps that run in that virtual machine, web browser, word processor, and so on, have their own window. The heading for that window indicates which virtual machine they're running on and is color-coded according to the level of trust the user should place in them. By default, Qubes comes with a Vault Cube that is not even connected to the internet. The Vault Cube is color-coded gray and is considered to be the most trusted cube. It is intended to be used to store things like sensitive documents and password manager files. On the opposite end is the default untrusted cube, color-coded in red. This might be the cube you would use to surf generic websites and wouldn't be a huge deal if it were compromised by malware that could spy on everything you're doing. Qubes also has the ability to spin up disposable virtual machines that are destroyed as soon as they're closed. So if you're going to some really sketchy website or opening a suspicious file, any malware you might have been exposed to will be destroyed when the VM is shut down. The color code is also intended to help the user avoid using the wrong virtual machine by accident if you're trying to compartmentalize identities. For instance, I use Qubes for my own real-life accounts, but also for this anonymously produced content. Qubes also comes with its own version of Whonix. There's a networking virtual machine called sys-Whonix, which serves as the Whonix gateway discussed previously. The non-Whonix virtual machine is equivalent to the Whonix workstation. Qubes has the advantage of being probably the most secure operating system that is still reasonably usable. It also is by far the easiest option available to chain a VPN after Tor for use on mainstream social media and video sharing websites. This is achieved by creating a simple VM cube for use as a VPN gateway, downloading your VPN configuration file, then clicking a few settings and set the Qubes network to sys-Whonix. The main disadvantage of Qubes is the learning curve. It is definitely not straightforward to use at first. I've included links to a few tutorial videos in the description that explain the basics, as well as links to Qubes documentation that should help you get started. Another disadvantage is that Qubes will not work on just any PC or laptop without issues, whereas Tails and Whonix will work on a much greater variety of hardware. Fortunately, the Qubes community maintains a list of laptops that are confirmed to be compatible with Qubes. I will go into more detail in the next video that discusses device selection. It's worth noting that Whonix on Qubes has a few security and anonymity disadvantages compared to standard Whonix. The details are fairly technical, and for most users, I do not think it warrants using standard Whonix over Qubes Whonix, in my opinion. I've included a link to a Whonix forum post that covers all of these disadvantages, if you're interested. And finally, Qubes shares the disadvantage with Whonix that everything is run inside a virtual machine, and is therefore slower and less responsive than it would be otherwise. You might think that using Qubes or Whonix would preclude the ability to use resource-intensive programs such as a video editor. But this is actually not the case, if you have somewhat modern hardware. I edited this very video on Qubes using Kdenlive, a free and open-source video editor. Granted, it is not as snappy as running directly on hardware, and takes longer to render videos, but it gets the job done just fine, and the security benefits are well worth the performance compromise, in my opinion. So in summary, I would recommend Qubes overall if you're willing to tackle the initial learning curve, and especially if you will be using mainstream accounts given the ease at which you can chain a VPN after Tor. If you're not planning to use mainstream accounts, use Qubes or possibly standard Whonix, especially if you believe the security and anonymity features that are lacking in Qubes Whonix makes a significant difference. If you're not planning on using mainstream platforms and you want the simplest possible solution, use Tails. Tails may also be the best option if your hardware is too old to run Whonix or Qubes with acceptable performance. I would personally not be comfortable creating content without using one of these 3 operating systems. But if for some reason the Tor network is too slow for your use case, I will grudgingly offer some recommendations. If you're not using Tor, you will need a VPN to protect your IP address, despite the shortcomings of VPNs that I explained earlier. If you're going to use a VPN, the only 2 I would recommend are Mullvad and iVPN. Both are well respected among privacy and security enthusiasts and accept Monero for payment. If you're unaware, Monero is an effectively untraceable cryptocurrency. I will cover Monero in more detail in a future video in this guide. If you're using Windows, Apple, or Linux for your OS, and depending on a VPN to conceal your IP address, I would strongly recommend to only work either away from your home on public Wi-Fi, or install a VPN firewall at your home. If you install a VPN firewall, do a fresh installation of your operating system, then only connect to that firewall for Wi-Fi access. Your own computer will have no idea what your true IP address is, and therefore would be unable to leak it. I will probably cover VPN firewalls in a future video, but if you're interested in pursuing this now, check out the website inteltechniques.com. The owner of this site sells an ebook specifically on how to set up a VPN firewall. It is involved, but well worth the effort, in my opinion. There are some less complicated, but also probably less secure options I will cover in a future video. For your main operating system, I would avoid using Windows, if at all possible. Every version of Windows since Windows 10 is essentially spyware masquerading as an operating system. Windows sends a tremendous amount of information back to Microsoft servers. Everything you type, microphone inputs, the name of every media file on your hard drive, and much, much more. This information, known as telemetry, can be reduced somewhat by adjusting settings within Windows itself and using third-party programs such as O&O Shutup 10, but it cannot be disabled completely. Every time Windows updates, it usually reverts some of these telemetry restrictions. It may also introduce new telemetry functions we're not even aware of. Windows is closed-source proprietary software, so as a user you're completely at their mercy as to what new functionality may be introduced with every new update. That said, the privacy risks of using Windows can be reduced somewhat. The best option would be to run Windows as a virtual machine within a Linux host OS. This can also be done in Qubes. This quarantines Windows and limits the information it can collect to some degree. When installing Windows, whether as your host OS or as a virtual machine, it's recommended that you disable internet access before doing so. This will enable you to create an offline account. From there, disable any data collection in Windows privacy settings and install O&O Shutup 10 to further reduce the telemetry Windows is transmitting. For an in-depth guide, see The Hitchhiker's Guide to Online Anonymity, Appendix A and Appendix B. Most of the same applies to Apple computers, although to a lesser extent. I've never used an Apple laptop or desktop computer, but after some research, I've come to the conclusion that Apple's marketing and reputation for privacy is only half true at best. While Apple may be decent at protecting your information from third parties, Apple itself possesses a large amount of data about you. So as with anything else you're placing your trust in, you must trust that this data is being protected from data breaches, or that rogue employees don't have access to it, or that they aren't covertly sharing all this data with government entities. A good rule of thumb: if a corporation is collecting data about you, assume it will become public at some point. The only way to protect yourself is to prevent them from collecting data in the first place. Unless there's some program that only runs on Windows or Apple devices that is essential for your content, and Tails, Whonix, and Qubes are not an option, I would strongly recommend Linux. Linux has several advantages over Windows and Apple. It has the advantage of being open source, so developers that maintain Linux should be able to spot any malicious code that was inserted into an update. With this, you're trusting the developers. But it's a much better situation than Windows or Apple, where it is impossible to scrutinize the source code at all. There was actually an example of this, with news breaking after I had finished the script for this video. It appears that some entity, probably a nation-state actor, attempted to sneak a backdoor into a Linux compression utility. Fortunately, a Microsoft engineer, of all people, discovered this backdoor after noticing some odd behavior with the compression utility. If this had happened on a proprietary operating system, the general public would have no way to investigate this, and the backdoor could continue to function until someone at the company noticed it and removed it, assuming it was ever detected at all. Linux also has either no telemetry or very limited telemetry that can be disabled quite easily. Ubuntu, one of the most popular distributions, has some very limited telemetry, but it explicitly allows you to opt out during installation. Keep in mind, though, some programs have their own telemetry, so make sure you research any programs you install as to whether they have any problematic telemetry of their own. Linux is also less susceptible to malware. Part of this has to do with privileges and access control features inherent to Linux, but also because hackers generally target Windows because it has a large and unsophisticated user base. Linux in 2024 is quite accessible for non-technical people. I've left a link in the description for how to get started using the Ubuntu distribution. I know of people in their 70s that use Ubuntu with basically no issues. If you have an opinionated friend that thinks Ubuntu is terrible, another option they might find to be more palatable is Linux Mint. In the past, using Linux required being fairly knowledgeable about Linux in general, and required using the command line, also known as the bash terminal. The only time I use the terminal is to install certain applications, which mostly consists of copying and pasting from tutorials I find online. For instance, one of the first applications I would install on any Linux distribution is LibreOffice. This is a free and open-source alternative to Microsoft Office that is extremely capable, unless you're some sort of Microsoft Office power user. To install it, open the terminal and type or copy-paste the following two commands: sudo apt update and sudo apt install LibreOffice. Then after it's done downloading and installing, you have an equivalent version of Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and so on. It's really that easy. There's also applications that come in the app image format. These are simply executable files. You may have to right-click on the file after it downloads, select Properties, select the Permission tab, then click Allow as Executable. Then just double-click the file to run. If you run into any issues, a simple Google search can probably find the solution. Although Ubuntu has its detractors in the Linux community, one undeniable advantage is that it has a large user base, so tutorials and troubleshooting forums will typically have the solution to any problem you encounter. By the way, I would avoid using Google at all for anything related to your content, but that's for another video. Suffice it to say for now, use DuckDuckGo, Startpage, or Brave Search. This concludes everything I wanted to say about operating systems for now. In the next video, we'll discuss